Okay, perfect. The session is now recording. Can I just get a thumbs up, just to confirm if everybody can hear me before I proceed? Okay, perfect. Welcome to the Research Capacity Development Unit at the University of Johannesburg. My name is Lawrence, and I am delighted to be your moderator for today's workshop. I would like to start off by thanking all the attendees for taking their time to join, and most importantly, our facilitators, Prof. Heather and Prof. Stein, for taking the time and for preparing to give this workshop based on understanding ethical principles and consideration in research. Before introducing them or before reading over their bios, I would like to go over a few housekeeping rules. If you do have any questions during the presentation, please raise your virtual hand. And if you do not wish to speak, please type your question in the chat box, and I will indicate the question to the presenter, and we will address the question. And as I stated in the beginning, that this session will be recorded, and we will request the presentation slides from our facilitators, and we'll upload all these workshop resources on our Moodle communities by the end of this week. And I will also be sharing a feedback survey in the chat session. So I would kindly request all the participants to kindly fill it out so that we may gain insight on how these workshops are useful and how we can also improve in the future, as well as to provide some kind words for our facilitators. Um, so just before I begin again, I'd just like to read over Prof. Christopher Stein's bio. Prof. Christopher Stein is qualified with a national diploma in emergency medical care in 1994 and began work as a lecturer in 1998. He obtained a bachelor's degree in post-school education, emergency medical care, and computer sciences in 1999, 2001, and 2005, respectively. These were followed by an honors degree in computer sciences in 2008 and a master's degree in emergency medicine in 2009. He completed a PhD in emergency medicine at the University of Cape Town in 2014 and is currently studying towards a second PhD in bioethics and health law at the University of Witwatersrand. Prostate interest falls mainly with the domain of clinical pre-hospital emergency care and emergency medical services system, but also includes areas such as statistics, research development, bioethics, research ethics, and computing. He is actively involved in research and has numerous international publications and local international scientific and invited conferences presentation. Prostain is a past president of the Emergency Care Society of South Africa and a past member of the Executive Committee of the African Federation for Emergency Medicine. He currently chairs the Faculty of Health Sciences Research Ethics Committee and the Senate Research Ethics Committee at the University of Johannesburg. Also, please allow me to read over Prof. Heather's bio. Prof. Heather Morris Ayton is an associate professor in the Department of Sport and Movement Studies in the Faculty of Health Sciences. Her undergraduate studies were in physical education with an honors in education, a master's in adult education at, at Wits University, a doctoral in sports science from the University of Johannesburg in 2016. Her research interest focuses on safeguarding and anti-doping, sports coaching, and women in sport. She sees herself as an academic practitioner where research gives informed data to enhance sport-related practice. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to our facilitators. You may now proceed and take over. Thank you so much.
Right. Thanks very much for that introduction. So I know we're running a little bit late, so I'll get straight into it. What we thought we would do for this workshop is to present it in the form of a number of questions. So I think you could probably think of these as kind of like frequently asked questions that have something to do with research ethics. And so I've got those questions up on the screen here that go on to the second slide, but these are the things that we will be covering, and I think these do touch on some quite important points and things that often come up in discussions about research ethics. Just one thing I must say is that we don't have time. Here's the other set of questions. We don't have time to go into a lot of detail with probably most of these questions, if not all of them. So please just bear that in mind. There is a lot that is a lot of detail in policy documents and things like that you can go and look up, and guidelines and standard operating procedures and things like that. So yeah, please just remember that this is really just to kind of point you, I think, in the right direction with regard to some of these questions. Okay, so that's an overview of the questions that we're going to be looking at. And please, I think I can't remember now what the house rules are, but I think it's fine if you want to post questions in the chat as we go along. If something comes into your mind while we're talking, please feel free to do that, or at the end as well. Okay, so yes, sorry.
I will indicate the questions to you, Prof. Not a problem.
Okay. Great.
Okay, I'll be monitoring the chat.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you.
Right. So let's have a look at this first question, and this is it's a fairly simple one, but it's a very, very, very important one, because I think if there's a lack of understanding here and you don't do something that you're supposed to do, that can turn out to be quite a problem. So the question is, when is ethical approval necessary, and how is it obtained? So to answer that question, I've referenced, you'll see at the bottom of the slide, the UJ's policy on research ethics. This was approved by Senate last year. And so the finer detail of all of this is in that policy. I've just tried to summarize it here and keep it fairly short. But basically, anytime you're doing research that includes humans as participants or animals, you will have to go through the ethics review process. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot this morning about animals. There is some animal research that is happening in the Faculty of Science, and they have their own animal research ethics committee. So it's a kind of a separate entity, and I'm not going to touch too much on that. But other than to just say that, research on animals is included in this requirement. But the thing I want to focus on more is research involving humans, because I think that applies to a lot more of the disciplines that are probably represented here today. So it's a fairly simple rule. If you're doing any research, regardless of the kind of research, regardless of how complicated or invasive it is, it could range from sort of health research, which is of a clinical nature, or it could be just a simple survey or qualitative research with interviews of people, anything of that nature. As long as it includes humans, it should go and undergo ethics review. If you have a look at the policy, it talks about waivers, meaning that there are some situations where you don't need to go through ethics review, and you can obtain a waiver from the relevant faculty research ethics committee. And I've just listed those things here. I've actually taken them straight out of the policy. So any research that's based purely or solely on information in the public domain, legislation or regulation. So, for example, you might be a researcher doing something like a systematic review, or a narrative review, or a scoping review, or something like that, where the entire research is just based on literature. You might be in the Faculty of Law, for example, doing a study where you are purely basing the whole thing on case law, in which case it would fall under the category of legislation. So if you're not interacting with humans at all as a source of your data, then you can apply for a waiver. And then secondly, that second point that you can see on the slide, research that doesn't at any point involve data that's derived from humans, animals, and public or private organizations. That last bit is actually quite important, because we tend to think about, just humans or animals. You've just got to be careful with organizations as well, even if you're not necessarily taking your data from individuals. But the big issue with organizations is personal information and compliance with POPIA, which I will speak to a little bit later on. But in the Protection of Personal Information Act, it does talk about natural persons and juristic persons, and juristic persons are obviously organizations. So for that reason, if the data that you are using for your search comes from an organization in the form of documents or whatever that is considered private or personal in the juristic sense, then you would need to go through ethics review as well. And then the other thing that you can get a waiver for, the last thing, is if you're doing in vitro laboratory studies. So, for example, working with things in a lab that are not directly derived from human or animal tissue. So an example in my own faculty is where researchers use commercial cell lines. So they do research involving cells, but these are cells that are commercially available that they buy overseas from a supplier. So yes, if you go back far enough, those cells were taken from tissue donors, but it's got to the point now where they are considered sort of commercial property, I suppose, if you want to call them that. And you don't need a waiver. Sorry, you can get a waiver for that as well. Okay, so those are basically the three sort of main categories of where you could apply for a waiver. And a waiver means that you get a letter from the ethics committee, and the letter says you don't need to undergo ethics review for that. All right, so I think that pretty much answers the question of when you need ethical clearance, when you need to go through this process of ethics review and approval. In terms of how to do it, I can't give you a lot of fine detail on that because each faculty has its own research ethics committee, and the detailed processes are relevant to each one of those different faculty RSCs. So you would need to get in touch with your faculty REC office, and they can give you the relevant forms and tell you more about the exact processes. So I'm not going to try and go into details of any particular faculty because I realize that you probably spread across a number of different faculties. But broadly speaking, this is just a very, very kind of abstract, sort of high-level view of the process. It's a very simple one. Basically, regardless of which faculty you're in, you'd have to apply through the Faculty Research Ethics Committee through their office. And usually what you have to submit as part of that application is an application form, which will just capture the details of you as the researcher, any other researchers that are involved, and stuff like that. You would obviously have to attach a research proposal. So there does need to be a research proposal, obviously, because the reviewers will need to try and understand what you're doing. And then there might be some other forms. So for example, one of the other forms that is coming into play at the moment is a form related to POPIA, and I'll expand on that a little bit further on when we get to that point. So, but it does vary from faculty to faculty. There might be some other things that you need to attach, and that whole cluster of things would constitute your application. So the application goes into the Research Ethics Committee. It will then undergo a review process, an ethical review process. So it will be given to one or more, depending on how things work in that faculty, to one or more ethics reviewers. They will have a look at it. It's a little bit like the peer review process, I suppose you could say, except that it's focused on ethics specifically. And so it goes through this process, and then the reviewers will give some feedback, and either they'll say, everything's fine, you don't need to change anything. But usually what they say is when it comes back, you need to make a few changes, which could range from, quite significant things. And then they may want you to resubmit so that they can have a second review, or it might be fairly minor things where they're just saying to you, please just change these things, and then, it doesn't need to come back. Once that has been done, you will then get an ethical clearance letter, and that letter is your evidence in writing that you have undergone ethical approval and everything is fine at that point. In some faculties, there is a requirement to renew ethical clearance, so it's not given in an open-ended kind of way. My own faculty is an example of that. We are quite tightly regulated by the Department of Health and the National Health Research Ethics Council, so they have very specific requirements about that. And so in the Faculty of Health Sciences, your ethical clearance is valid for 12 months, and then you have to renew it. So this doesn't necessarily apply to every single faculty, though. So that is just, if it applies, it's another step after initial ethical approval that you have to renew. Okay, so if there is a requirement that you do need ethics review and approval, you need to go through that process. Very, very important that you do, and that you only start the research once you have that ethical clearance letter in your possession. It's seen as quite a significant and a serious thing if you engage in research with people, with humans, and you haven't gone through this process. So that's why I've put it up in big letters in this red box, because it is really important. And it would be rather foolish to think that you're going to save a bit of time by bypassing this process. Yes, it does take a little bit of extra time. But the problem is when you submit for examination at the end, certainly at that point, they're going to want that letter. And then you can run into a lot of trouble if you haven't gone through the process. Okay, so that's just something that's very important to keep in mind. Okay, so that's the first one, the first question. The second question that we got was about the guiding principles of research ethics. And I'm just summarizing them very, very quickly here. I've, in fact, just put everything on one slide. There is quite a lot more to each one of these principles. And certainly, if you search online for them, you'll find quite a lot of material about them. Their background is that they actually come from bioethics. That's their kind of origin. And so depending on what your background is in your discipline, some people are quite suspicious of this, and they're kind of thinking, well, this is more like it's a biomedical health sort of thing, and it doesn't really apply, to other disciplines. Now there is some validity, I think, to that argument. The only problem is that if you don't use these 4 principles as a guide when you're thinking about research ethics, it's very difficult to kind of imagine, what else would guide you, because they're in very, very widespread use. They've become, cynically, some people refer to them as a kind of a mantra. They've become so widely used. So although they do have their origins in a field that might not be the same as yours, I think they are broadly enough applicable that they can actually be quite helpful. And certainly, even in other faculties outside of health, these are generally the guiding principles that are used. So just to go through them very quickly, the first one is the principle of respect for autonomy, and that is basically, when it comes to research participation, respecting each individual's, I guess, it's really a right to make their own decisions, to have a choice about whether they want to participate in research or not. So obviously, in a medical research context, this is a very, very big thing. But I think broadly speaking, regardless of the kind of research or the field or the discipline, the same principle applies, that people should always have the right to choose whether they're going to participate or not. One of the key points with this is that the decisions must be voluntary, and there's quite a lot that goes into that about what makes a decision to participate in research voluntary. I'm not going to elaborate on that now, but it is obviously a key point of this whole principle. And obviously, this is just a broad, kind of almost abstract principle, but it's applied in actual practical research through the process of informed consent. So this principle is kind of actualized through approaching potential participants and telling them about the research, all the information that they need to make an informed decision, and then actually documenting that decision, on a consent form or something like that. And so, yeah, that is basically the first principle. A lot of people would argue it's of the four the most important one, because there are some legal requirements about informed consent and what you can and can't do without informed consent. Most of those, again, relate to the health field. That is basically the only kind of field or discipline where there's actual statute or law that regulates this. But as a broad principle, again, I think in everyday life we accept that if we're going to make a decision to do something, it's a voluntary decision that needs to be captured somewhere, recorded somewhere in the form of informed consent. Okay, the second one is the principle of beneficence. And that is basically the principle that if at all possible, research should benefit participants, but it's not an obligation at all. Again, this has roots in the health field where, if people are taking part in health research and they're possibly putting themselves at risk, that there should be a balance. And the thing that counterbalances risk is the potential for benefit. So it sort of has its roots there, but I think it is also fairly broadly applicable. I think you can probably, imagine a lot of research, maybe even research that you're doing, that doesn't necessarily have direct benefits for participants, which is fine, provided the risks are minimal. If research starts becoming risky at a level of risk above minimal risk would be kind of the risks of everyday life, the sort of everyday things that we do and the risks associated with that. As soon as research becomes more risky than that, then generally there's an expectation that there should be something to counterbalance that in the form of benefits. The third principle is the principle of non-maleficence, and that is that foreseeable harm should never be done or come to participants through their participation in research. We do acknowledge, as with everything in life, that sometimes unforeseeable things happen, and those can result in some harm to research participants. But those are generally very rare. The emphasis here is on foreseeable risk. So we shouldn't put research participants in harm's way in a foreseeable way, just so that we can get our research done, basically. And you'll find that the second and third principles here, beneficence and non-maleficence, are often, in fact, almost always thought about together. So we talk about the risk-benefit ratio of research. And basically the idea there is that we always want to make sure that the risk of harm and the potential for benefit are well balanced. As soon as there's an imbalance, particularly where there are risks without potential benefits, at least, it starts to become quite questionable, whether that research is ethically justifiable. Okay, and then the last one is the principle of justice, and that is people often talk about distributive justice, meaning that there should be fairness in exposure to the burdens and the risks and the benefits of research, meaning that it should never be the case that research participants are exposed to greater or lesser risks or benefits because of a particular group that they belong to. So, for example, it should never be the case in a particular research study that according to your gender or according to your race or according to your socioeconomic level, whatever it is, that you're exposed to greater or lesser risk or benefit. Those things should be distributed equally amongst all participants. Just to add at the end here, this principle of justice has taken on a slightly different meaning in probably about the last 10 or 15 years, maybe a little bit longer. It started out with a great deal of emphasis on fairness, meaning that if certain categories or groups of people were vulnerable, that they should be excluded from research. Vulnerable meaning at high risk of being exploited, which is a sound idea. I think you would agree. However, it kind of got a little bit out of control years ago, and this is like in the late 70s, early 80s, where a degree of overprotection started coming into research ethics, and certain categories of people were, in retrospect, we now realize, unfairly excluded from research in the name of protecting them. And so this whole principle of justice has evolved a little bit over time, meaning that now it also emphasizes the fact that pretty much everybody has a right to participate in research, bearing in mind that with some research, at least, there might be potential benefit from participating. And it's not actually fair to exclude people unless there's a very, very good reason. And in fact, in most cases, it's not necessary to completely exclude people because they are perhaps in a vulnerable group. Usually, safeguards can be put in place to protect their interests, and they can still participate. So these days, it's usually quite rare to say, a certain type of research or particular project can't be done because it constitutes too much of a risk. There are normally ways of managing that. Okay, so moving on to the next one. Those were the 4 principles. There was a question about what are the considerations for research with minors. Now this is an interesting one because, again, most of in fact, all of the law and a lot of the ethics guidelines speak to this within the context of health research. But obviously, minors could be involved in research in many other disciplines. I think one of the important things to understand is that if you go to the National Health Act, which I've abbreviated here as NHA, if you go to the National Health Act, there is a definition of health research, and it encompasses fields like social research and psychology as well. That's all covered under this umbrella term of health research. So it might be the case maybe that people in social sciences are kind of thinking, well, we're not doing health research, but according to the Act, it is actually included in that definition. So I'm going to talk about minors and research and the important considerations through this kind of health research lens, but it is an important one, and it is actually quite broad, covers a lot of different disciplines. So for the purposes of research, a minor is anybody under the age of 18, which is a very simple rule to remember. And if you do research and you want to include minors as participants, that is anybody under the age of 18, they must have consent from a parent or legal guardian. So that is an absolute requirement, regardless of their age, regardless of whether they're 17 and a half or 1 year old. It doesn't matter. The research can only be legally done if there's consent from a parent or a legal guardian. However, if you go and have a look at the Children's Act, there's an important principle in the Children's Act that wherever possible, children should participate in decisions about them. And obviously that varies a lot because children are all at different stages of maturity and understanding. But the Act basically says if a child is old enough to understand something, they should meaningfully participate in decisions about that thing. And that applies to research as well. So the basic idea is that for older children, and it's difficult to give you an age cutoff. It actually varies quite a lot depending on what you read. Some go as low as 7 years old. Some are more sort of in the range of about 10 years old. I think it depends a lot on the research as well, the complexity of the research. But let's just say somewhere in the region of probably it would be reasonable to say about 8 to 10 years old, where the children start to become capable of understanding simple research. That in cases like that, where the child is old enough, in the researcher's judgment, that parental consent gives the researcher permission to ask the child. So I think a lot of people misunderstand parental consent and consent from a legal guardian. That consent is the decision about whether the child participates in research. It actually isn't. If the child is old enough, then the parental consent is purely just permission for the researcher to approach the child and to actually ask them. And it's really the child's decision that is the final decision, and that is referred to as assent. So people under the age of 18 can't make their own independent decisions about research participation, but where they are considered to be old enough, they can make what the law refers to as an assisted decision. So it goes through the parent first or the legal guardian, but the child actually decides whether they want to participate or not. Obviously, for younger children, if you're talking about really young children, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 years of age, you're just obviously not going to get the understanding that is required to make an informed decision. And so in cases like that, the consent of the parent or the legal guardian is the only thing that is required. And that is that will reflect the decision of whether they're going to participate or not. There is also in the National Health Research Ethics Council guidelines, which are published by the Department of Health, and these are guidelines that provide guidance specifically in the field of health research. In those guidelines, you will find that there is reference to independent minor consent, which sounds a little bit confusing because what I've just said is wherever you want to do research with minors, there must be consent of a parent or legal guardian. The inaccurate guidelines do suggest, bearing in mind that this is not actually compliant with the National Health Act, but what they're saying in the guidelines is there might be situations where getting parental consent is not in the child's best interest. And so these kind of situations don't come up very often. But an example might be where a researcher is wanting to do a study, and the subject of the study is child physical or sexual abuse. Maybe the focus of the study or the subject of the study is substance abuse or underage sex or something like that, where it might be very, very difficult to approach the parent or the legal guardian for consent. For obvious reasons. In fact, if it's an abuse type scenario, it might pose a threat to the child. So what the inaccurate guidelines are suggesting in situations like that it could be justifiable to actually leave out the parental or legal guardian consent and just get independent consent from the child. So that door is open in those sort of situations. But it is structured. If you go and have a look at the guidelines, it is subject to very strict conditions. There's a whole set of conditions that you need to meet, and it's really only applicable to adolescents. In other words, children who are old enough to understand what's going on and to make an informed decision. So this would typically be maybe your 15, 16, 17-year-old sort of age group, where it might be possible to convince an ethics committee that you should be able to do this.
Okay, Prof.
Yes.
May I please interject? There is some questions in the chat box.
Yes, okay, I see that.
Yes.
I just want to get consent from children of child-headed family without a guardian during a search involving orphans. Wow, that's a really easy question.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's unfortunate in South Africa there are, this is not a completely uncommon kind of question or scenario. And legally it's an extremely difficult one because obviously in a case like that there is not a parent or a legal guardian. There is some guidance, just to go back to those inaccurate guidelines, there is some guidance um, in those guidelines about this particular scenario. And if I remember correctly, they talk about maybe getting a social worker involved if that's possible. And they have a sequence or a series of suggested ways of doing it, from a kind of a best case to a worst case scenario. I actually can't remember all of the details, but they do offer some guidance about that in the inaccurate guidelines. Obviously, if you sort of going from first options through to last option, it becomes legally more and more challenging and more and more difficult. But obviously, the trade-off that an ethics committee has is to try and facilitate important research, but still at least have an element of protection for children in this kind of situation, because I think that is the concern. The concern is that somehow they might be exploited as part of the research process. And that's really the role that the parent or legal guardian plays, is that level of protection, not as a decision maker in all cases, but just as a kind of a gatekeeper almost to make sure that their children are not being exploited. So I think to answer the question, I would refer you to the INATRIC guidelines. I can supply a copy afterwards, maybe. It's a freely available document, so I can email it to whoever would like to have a copy. Alternatively, if you go to the Department of Health's website and you have a look under the National Health Research Ethics Council, you'll find a copy of the guidelines there. Heather?
Thanks, Chris. I think the important thing that you also mentioned was that whole thing around gatekeeping. So, for example, students not only in our faculty, but also the education faculty, where they are going into schools to do whatever kind of research in a particular setting. That gatekeeping consent also forms part of ethical principles and considerations. So you can't just walk into a school, for example, and say, I've got ethical clearance, I've got consent form from the parents, I want to come into the school and do some research. You have to get that gatekeeping permission from the school, and then also from the Department of Education, or depending on what the setting is, if you're in the sports environment, then you would need to go to the chairman of a club, or to the province, or to the national federation. So I think that gatekeeping is also a very important part of making sure that the ethical processes are followed through. And we look at that in terms of what gatekeeping permissions have you sought and may have received prior to you even submitting your proposal to your DRC or even the REC. Thanks.
Thanks, Heather. Yeah, that's actually an important one, that after ethical approval, seeing as we're talking about minors, if you wanted to do research and you wanted to sample children in a school setting, then you would need the provincial Department of Health permission to do that, and usually in addition to that, the actual school as well. But certainly you need the provincial department also. Okay. Yeah. So I've just the last thing I was talking about here was independent minor consent. It's a tricky thing. This, ethics committees based on a strong enough case that's made by researchers can do this. But But I say it's tricky because it's actually falling outside of what is considered lawful. You know, if you go and have a look at the National Health Act, for example. So it is a difficult one. But in scenarios where it's applicable, it's actually quite important because there might be situations where it really isn't in the child's best interests to approach the parent first and get their consent. Okay, and then just at the end here, so the documents that you would need if you're doing research with minors, the documents that you need from a consent perspective would be a consent form that the parent or legal guardian would sign, and obviously together with that would be information about the research in writing. And then separate to that, if the child was old enough, is that you would have a separate assent form, which is similar to a consent form. In other words, there's information about the research that's written in the form, and there's a place for the child to sign. The difference, obviously, is that the assent form would be written at a level where a child of the kind of age that you're targeting for the research would be able to understand it. And people have done some quite creative things with the assent forms. For example, you know, putting pictures in and cartoons and what have you, just to make the details of research a bit more understandable. But I think just to stress that, you know, this quick, because there was a question in the chat about, you know, when is a child old enough to understand this? I think obviously their age is the most important factor, but the nature of the research must also be taken into consideration. So if you wanted to just do a fairly simple survey or something like that, that's not too difficult to understand. You know, I'm just going to ask you a few questions. This is what the questions are about, etc., etc. On the other end of the spectrum, you know, in health research, it might be something like a clinical trial, for example, which is very, very complex. And there you might have a child who's even 13, 14 years old, and still you might not think that it would be appropriate to explain that kind of complexity, or there might not be a viable way of actually explaining that type of thing. Okay, and then the last thing is just
Prof, there is another questions again in the chat box.
okay, I'll get to it in a second. This is a very small point at the end here. It's just a legal requirement.
Okay,
that
thank you.
That for non-therapeutic research with minors, non-therapeutic meaning there are no health benefits associated with research. According to the Act, you need ministerial consent, which is absolutely crazy, because can you imagine waiting for a letter from the Minister of Health to do your research? You could wait a very long time. So that ministerial consent has been delegated to research ethics committees since 2014. It's just an additional thing to note. It's another requirement. And okay, so the question is about gatekeeper permission for key informant interviews. I think the idea of gatekeeper permission depends on whether the participants that you are wanting in your research sort of fall within an organization that needs to give permission. Maybe just to clarify that if you're approaching people in their personal capacity about something, then you don't need to get permission from anybody else. You just need the consent of that person. However, it's a little bit different if somebody, let's say, is working at UJ. Let's say I'm a lecturer at UJ, and you want to interview me and you want to ask me questions about my work at UJ and what I think about this, and how maybe it's a study on performance management and how does UJ do performance management. Those are questions that are very specific to the organization, and for those types of questions and that type of participation, you would want to be approaching the organization first and getting permission to do that. So it depends on the situation, but the general rule is, you know, if you're asking people for their personal views on things that are not related to a work environment or to their employer or anything like that, then you normally don't need gatekeeper permission. Obviously, with children, the example that we used earlier, children in a school are, while they're at school, they are under the protection of the school and at a higher level, the provincial department. So, so you do need to get the permission there. Sure, a lot of questions. Okay, so radiographs and consent. Maybe if I could suggest, sorry, I'm just looking at this other question now, just trying to get through all of these. Do I need my supervisor's consent to apply for? No. So that you need them to sign off on your documents. So there's obviously an important oversight role that the supervisor plays throughout the entire research process. So your supervisor would need to sign off on the application form for ethics and for other approvals that you might need as well, for example, high degrees committee. But that's, I guess we probably refer to that as permission, and oversight rather than consent in the kind of way that we're talking about it here. Maybe if I could just ask with the radiograph question, there's another section on a short section on POPIA. If I could maybe come back to that there, because I think it might fit in quite well with that one. Oh, and that's the next one. There we go. Okay, so what does it mean for research to be compliant with the Protection of Personal Information Act? And again, just as I said at the beginning, there's quite a lot of detail here that I'm not going to go into because we don't have time. This is just an overview of the process. But basically, to answer the question, what does it mean to be compliant with POPIA? Maybe it's even better to start with a high level question, and that is, when do you need to be compliant with the Protection of Personal Information Act? So the answer is at the top of the slide there, that first point is that whenever you're processing personal information, whenever you're doing that, you need to be compliant with POPIA. If you're not doing that, then you don't need to worry about POPIA. So to follow on from that point, when are you processing personal information? What does that mean? So let's just start with personal information and what it is, and we'll talk on the next slide about what processing means. But personal information is any information that relates to an identifiable person. And as I mentioned a little while ago, that includes both living natural persons, in other words, human beings. But also, if you're going to have a look at the Act, it talks about juristic persons, meaning companies, organizations, etc. So it's important to understand the Act actually applies to both. It applies to natural persons, humans, and companies or organizations, etc. That's a point that I think a lot of people forget. And the other important thing, just to emphasize here, is I'll sort of get this point in. Is this word here, identifiable information. So personal information, it can be a wide range of things, and I've given some examples in the point below this. But the key thing to remember is that it must be information that can uniquely identify an individual. So there's some examples here. Sorry, some examples here in this point over here. Obvious ones: your name, your ID number, your phone number, your email address, your physical address. A photograph is, you can obviously uniquely identify a person through a photograph of their face. A student number, a hospital number, the list goes on and on, but any unique identifier is considered to be personal information. Those are obvious examples. I think you would agree. There are some less obvious ones. So, for example, when you can put individual variables together that are not unique identifiers, sometimes, depending on the situation, they might uniquely identify somebody. So, for example, the example that everybody uses is if you're doing a survey. Let's say you're doing a survey in a company, And one of your survey questions is, what position do you hold in the company? And there are a number of different options there, or maybe it's a free text thing, and the person just types in, you know, I'm an accountant, or I'm in sales, or whatever, and then you get one person who says, I'm the CEO of the company. Obviously, there's only one CEO, so you would then know who that person is. So those are examples. They're not that don't come up that often, but sometimes by the uniqueness of a response, or by putting different variables together, by aggregating them, when normally on their own they wouldn't identify somebody, sometimes you can end up with a situation where they do. But the most important ones, so it's worth considering those ones, but the most important ones in sort of everyday examples are these ones here, in terms of personal information. So that's what personal information is. It's information that can uniquely identify an individual. And processing is quite simple. It's everything basically that you do with that information from the time when you collect it to the time when you destroy it. So from a research perspective, the moment you get that data from a participant, everything that you do, that how you store it, how you analyze it, whatever, up until the point where you get rid of it, is considered to be processing. Okay, so I think that's fairly clear. Just to go back to the radiograph example, are radiographs or X-rays, just to use another word, are they considered to be personal information? By default, they are, because normally on an X-ray, there would be a recording of some patient details. You would have their name, or maybe a hospital number, or something on there. Now, it is possible with any records, whether they're X-rays or whether it's other records from any kind of database or any kind of system, it is possible, if they do have unique identifiers in them, to de-identify the data. So it is possible to take personal information and remove the identifiers. And then if you can do that effectively, it then is not personal information anymore. So that is always an option. Another example might be, for example, health records. You know, in a patient's file, that doesn't have to be an X-ray. It could just be pieces of paper or whatever, doctor's notes that are sitting in a file in a hospital or clinic. Provided you can remove the identifiers, so you can take the person's name or their ID number or whatever it is off there, then that ceases to become personal information. And then you can treat it as kind of anonymous or not personal information. So that's always an option. The question, just to pause here quickly about the X-rays, the question was, explain the approach to consent in private practice, government hospital, and university-linked hospital. In terms of consent, this kind of data is a little bit tricky in the sense that it's usually retrospective. So these, for example, would be X-rays. Obviously, they already exist in some kind of repository somewhere, and you're coming along maybe years later, and you're wanting to do research with those X-rays for some reason. Consent is difficult because when the X-ray was taken, it's rare, unless there's something in writing, it's rare that the person would have actually consented at that point to what you want to use the X-rays for at this point. But the way that this is usually approached, and this applies to most data for secondary use, in other words, data that exists already where researchers want to go back and access it. Normally, the situation with personal information is that if you de-identify it, then normally you would not need participant consent. So if you take the unique identifiers out of that data, then usually that takes away the requirement for consent. But there is a process to be followed for that. It's slightly more complicated than what I've just said now. The other option is that in some teaching hospitals, for example, university clinics as well, is that when patients sign up, when they fill in the forms, you know, when they first go to the clinic, there's a statement about that they agree to the data of whatever nature being used for research purposes. And so if they've signed that kind of statement, then that normally covers the consent angle, except that it would still be best practice, obviously, to remove personal identifiers. I think generally, whenever you're doing retrospective research, the assumption is that unless there's a very specific reason why they have to be personal identifiers in the data, by default you would remove them. Okay, so just to carry on quickly and finish this, for POPIA compliance with research, one of the key things that has to be done is something called a personal information impact assessment. This is now according to the Act and regulations, and that must be done before the research starts. And so what is happening across all faculties at UJ is that this process is being incorporated into the ethics approval process. Bearing in mind that POPIA compliance is not actually a thing about ethics. It's a question of legal compliance. So it doesn't, strictly speaking, have to come in here, but a decision has been taken at UJ that it's a logical place to put the POPIA compliance process. Because, to be honest, we weren't too sure where else to put it, for research specifically. Okay, so the way that this works is there's a personal information impact assessment form that has to be completed as a first step. It's kind of like a checklist. It is quite a long one. But it's basically, it's a whole series of items, and the researcher would then go through that and tick, a lot of the items in the list ask about is, do you explain such and such a thing in your proposal? Are you doing this? Are you doing that? And so those responses are generally yes, no, or in some cases not applicable. So the researcher, as a first step, goes through that checklist, and it is considered to be a self-assessment. That's a very important point. This happens before ethics review. So it's a self-assessment, and the aim behind that is, the purpose of that is to allow the researcher, before they submit for ethics, to go through this checklist and check and see if there are any gaps with regard to POPIA compliance, and to fix them, obviously, if there are. That's really the purpose of the exercise. When that person then submits for ethics review, that impact assessment form is also submitted, and as part of the ethics review, the ethics reviewer will also have a look at the form, and just as a kind of a second check, make sure that there are no compliance gaps. If there are, they will send that back to the researcher and say, look, you forgot to do this, or this isn't clear in your proposal, or whatever. Please fix that. And then once it's fixed, the whole process can proceed. So then, at the end of the ethics review process, the letter that the researcher gets to say you have ethical approval also covers POPIA compliance as well. So that is the process that's being adopted at UJ for this specifically. And just to highlight, this is just for research that I'm talking about here. Obviously, there are many other different dimensions to POPIA compliance for other data. I'm just focusing here specifically on research. Okay, then before I go on to the next one, there was just another question. Who gives consent for radiographs in government, university-linked hospitals? So let's just differentiate between consent and permission. Previously, what I said is that if you de-identify data, like X-rays, for example, you take the identifying data, or most of the time, generally, you can get around the problem of consent. You can actually use that without the consent of the patient. You would still need permission from the hospital. And generally speaking, when it comes to gatekeeper permissions, once you've got ethical approval from hospitals, if it's a private hospital group, they usually have a research committee that you can approach, and they're the gatekeepers. They will give you that permission if you meet all their requirements. For provincial hospitals, or in fact any provincial healthcare facility, there is a provincial health research committee that has oversight of that process. So for provincial, you have to go through the Health Research Committee. And all of them have electronic portals that you can upload your request to. And for private healthcare groups, you just have to find out who the contact person is there for each of the different companies. Okay, right. So now we move on to what are the consequences of not having ethical clearance in place. So what happens if you need to have ethical clearance in place, as we discussed right at the beginning, but you don't do that? So it is considered a form of academic misconduct. And it is serious because it's not just a policy requirement from an internal thing. In many cases, it is also a legal requirement. So certainly, if you're doing health research, it becomes a legal requirement. You are acting unlawfully if you don't go through this process. So what happens at the moment depends on usually whether it's undergrad or postgrad. If it's undergrad, bearing in mind that there is undergrad research as well, there are honours qualifications. There are also 4-year degrees that often have a research component in the final year. That will usually be referred to student ethics and judicial services. And they manage the process from there. If it's postgrad, it will normally be channeled through the Senate Research Ethics Committee and eventually end up at Senate Higher Degrees, where a decision will be made as to what happens in those processes. But I think the most important thing is just please avoid that at all costs. It's a very nasty thing when it gets to the point where it's discovered. And because we have policies and because the policies are quite clear, it's not, to say that I didn't know about it is not really an excuse that is accepted. So yeah, please just make sure if you do need ethical approval that it is actually in place. Okay, and then I think this is not the last one. Might be the third last one, I think. What is the difference between research ethics and research integrity? I phrased the question this way because there were a number of points that we were given about what happens if people act unethically. What happens, I think there's a reference somewhere to plagiarism as well. And I think it can be encompassed quite well under this one question. So just to highlight these two things, the focus of this presentation, this workshop, is really actually research ethics. And research ethics focuses on the protection of research participants. That's why research ethics committees exist. That is, their job is to make sure that research participants are treated in an ethical way. So now you ask yourself a question, okay, what happens if somebody does some other bad thing, like they plagiarize, for example, or they fabricate data? Does that fall under research ethics? It doesn't actually fall under research ethics. That falls under something called research integrity. And research integrity focuses on the conduct or the behavior of the researcher themselves. So just to use very briefly, just use plagiarism as an example. If you plagiarize, let's say you're writing a thesis and you plagiarize in the literature review, that's not going to harm a research participant. Let's assume you've done everything else correct, but you've just plagiarized in the literature review. It's not going to be harmful to a research participant, but it's considered ethically to be a problem. So that's just to illustrate, that's something outside of research ethics specifically, but it's obviously still a problem. So there is overlap between these two things, but they're not exactly the same thing. And so what we find with people doing research, engaging with research at any level, whether it's undergrad, postgrad, postdoctoral research fellows, staff members doing their own research, whatever it is that research behavior, if we're thinking specifically about this now, the conduct or behavior of researchers exists on a spectrum. So on the one side, we have responsible conduct of research, and that is basically doing everything according to policy the way you're supposed to do it with integrity, in a trustworthy kind of way. And that's obviously the behavior that is expected of all researchers. Unfortunately, not everybody does that. So in the middle, there's a kind of a gray area, which is referred to as questionable research practices. And these are things that are a little bit, they're not mainstream. They're kind of exactly as the term implies, they are questionable, but they're not yet misconduct. Okay, so they're sort of dodgy things, but they're not that bad that they would be classified as misconduct. And then on the other side of the spectrum over here, we have academic misconduct. So that's the kind of the spectrum of researcher behaviors. And research integrity is concerned or concerns itself with all of these things. So just to touch on academic misconduct briefly, if you go to different places, different universities, different countries, it's defined in slightly different ways. But usually it covers things like plagiarism, fabrication, and falsification. And certainly in our case, it also covers doing research without ethical approval. Those are all considered to be, if the allegations turn out to be true, those are then things that are considered to be academic, or in our case, we're talking about research specifically, research misconduct. Bearing in mind that academic misconduct can be treated in the exam as well at undergrad level. Okay, so what happens if these things occur? Well, they're managed according to policy. And at the moment, we have several policies that cover at least some of these things. I'm sure you're aware we have a plagiarism policy, which obviously covers plagiarism as a form of misconduct. We have an authorship policy because in fact, the most frequent area for research misconduct is actually authorship. And then, those are the two main ones at the moment, but maybe just to mention that the plagiarism policy at the moment is undergoing a very significant review to broaden it to cover all these different types of misconduct. Okay, and then just these last two, this is one, there was a specific point about data collection. And I put these things together. Heather, maybe if you want to come in with any other things that you can think of, because this was quite a mix of things. But just some considerations that I thought were important with ethical behavior during data collection. The most obvious one probably would be that if there is a requirement, which there generally is, almost in every case, for participants to consent, that in fact before you start collecting data from them, that they have consented, unless it's a situation where you're doing secondary data collection and you've been through a process where you don't need to get consent. But generally, if you're interacting with human participants, then you would need to get consent. So just to make sure that is in place before you collect data. Usually when you're collecting data directly from participants, whether it's a survey or interviews, or you're taking their blood pressure or whatever it is, it could be a million things. But regardless of that, there usually is some degree of privacy that participants expect, even if it's just filling in a questionnaire, just to make sure that participants have a private place to sit, a quiet place where they can do it on their own without people looking over their shoulder or whatever the case may be. So that's also quite important responsibility. And then obviously once you have the data, once it's actually been collected, there is a responsibility on every researcher to make sure that it is protected and looked after, and that nobody who doesn't have authorization to access or work with that data actually can get their hands on it. That applies broadly to all data, but it's especially important if there is personal information. So that personal information impact assessment that I spoke about just now, that looks very, very closely at, if you are processing personal information, how you control access to it, how you look after it, how you secure it, etc. So that's an important one. Another thing linked to consent is that it's a general principle of consent that wherever somebody gives consent, they can freely withdraw it at any time. So a participant can change their mind at any time. They can approach you and say, I don't want to participate anymore. I'm withdrawing my consent. And there should obviously be no consequences for that. It should be an absolutely free process. So I think the important thing to remember is just to remember that and make sure that as a researcher you are available. So you give your contact details, for example, to participants that if they want to do this, it's not like impossible to get hold of you, to do this, that it's an easy process if they want to do it. And then I think this is the last one from me on this, is that this depends on the research that you're doing, but if your research involves the possibility of some kind of psychological stress or the possibility of psychological harm or risk of physical harm, obviously, or the identification of a disorder or a disease, that in all of those three cases, researchers do have some responsibilities. So in the case of 1 and 2, I think the responsibility would be that if somebody does suffer some kind of harm, that you can A, pick that up, and B, refer them to an appropriate place to get help. So one example might be somebody who's doing an interview, and during the interview they are talking about experiences from their past which were quite traumatic, and they start remembering some of these things, etc. And they start getting distressed. So that person should be then referred to somebody who, a counselor who can help them. An example of point 3 there is if you are doing some kind of screening, maybe you're screening using a tool that is capable of, like it generates a score on burnout or anxiety, or maybe you're just measuring people's blood pressures, for example, and you come across not unusual, but abnormal results. So somebody scores very high on an anxiety score, which means potentially they might have a problem, even though it's just a screening tool. Or you take a blood pressure, the blood pressure is very high. The researcher does have responsibility then to tell that person, this is the result we got. This might indicate a problem. Please, just refer them somewhere to have it checked out. So those are important things. Whenever you're doing that type of thing, just to make sure that people with abnormalities or things that suggest they might have a problem are not just ignored, but that they don't know about those things. Okay, this is the last one. I need to go to another lecture in a short while, so let me just go through this fairly quickly. This was I think it was the last on the list that we got to cover. It was about incentives, or incentives for research participation and ethical. So in research ethics terminology, if you use an incentive of some kind, it's usually referred to as an inducement. And I think that the important thing to remember is that the purpose for doing this is to induce a change in somebody's behavior. That is the whole point behind it. So by doing this, you would want somebody to change their mind and participate. That is the purpose behind it. So the question is doing that morally a problem? Is it unethical, etc.? So maybe just to focus on when it would usually be done. Typically, it's done where researchers are thinking that recruiting participants is going to be difficult. So they're anticipating that maybe the response might be not so great for whatever reason. And so they're thinking that, maybe if we offer some money or a voucher of some kind, whatever, it will induce more people to participate. So that's the basic idea behind it. But it's important to differentiate between two things, because there is a related thing that quite often comes up. And that is to differentiate between incentive and compensation. So if you're doing research and and you are expecting research participants to spend money on participating in your research, then it's generally accepted that there is responsibility on you as the researcher to compensate them. Otherwise, it's quite unfair because they're doing a whole lot of they're spending a whole lot of their money to give you the benefits of getting your data and doing your research. So examples could be travel. You might be collecting data at a particular site of whatever nature it is, and you're expecting the participants maybe getting a taxi, travel to that site, or if they have a car, whatever the case may be, they will then be out of pocket for that amount to facilitate your research. So giving those people money back to cover those costs is compensation. I'm just trying to differentiate and say that's not an incentive. That's purely just to compensate them for money that they have spent to participate in research. And obviously that is absolutely fair. In fact, it's something that would be expected of researchers to compensate participants. But when it comes to incentives, which are different, so this is purely something that is given to a participant to induce them to participate. It's not a form of compensation. This question of, is it, a lot of people are very skeptical about this, and they think it's like a form of bribery or something like that, that you're doing something unethical. But generally speaking, there isn't very much wrong morally with providing an incentive or an inducement, provided you are pretty sure of two things. The first one is that what you're asking the participant to do is not morally questionable. Obviously, if you are asking a research participant to do something bad, something morally wrong for your research, and you're saying you're realizing that most people wouldn't want to do that, and so you're saying, okay, I'll give you 1,000 rand if you do that thing. That is obviously very questionable. But if the thing you're asking them to do is to just fill out a survey question, just a very simple thing, that is not morally problematic, then generally there isn't a problem with that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the nature of the incentive doesn't cloud their ability to understand risks. So if you're doing research that has a risk level greater than minimal risk, it might sometimes happen that because the risk is higher, researchers think, well, if we offer people a really nice incentive, they might sort of overlook the risk or ignore the risk, and then participate. So I think morally that would be a problem because it might cloud their judgment about the risk. And obviously we don't want to do that. We want, from an informed consent perspective, every participant to fully understand the risks involved and to make a freely voluntary decision. So in general, there is, although it's often quite frowned on, and a lot of people seem to think it is problematic, generally from an ethics perspective, there isn't a problem provided those two bases are covered. And the last point there is just, something that some people do is they say, well, it's better if you tell the person about the research, then you ask them to sign the consent form, they sign the consent form, and then you say, oh, by the way, now that you've given me consent, I'll give you an airtime voucher. Which is okay, it makes a lot of people feel better that you're not influencing their decision because you're waiting for them to decide first and then you're telling them, which is fine. There's no problem with it. The only thing is that it's not an inducement. So by doing that, you haven't changed their behavior. And I'm just mentioning that because the purpose of inducing people is specifically to make them participate when perhaps they might not have, if you hadn't done it. So, but some people just, feel that it's they're more comfortable doing it that way. All right, colleagues, so that's all from my side with regard to the questions rather, that was sent to us. I don't know if there's anything else, or Heather, anything from listener.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I know that you have to go, so if you do need to, then that's fine. But I just wanted to pick up something about the difference between confidentiality and anonymity. And when the participants can actually remove themselves or ask for permission to remove themselves from the research process, and how that actually needs to be written up in the proposal.
Yeah, Heather, I think that's actually a really important one. Can I maybe leave that with you? I just
Yeah.
have to go and do the other one now, colleagues. So yeah, I'll leave that in Heather's capable hands. Thanks very much for listening, and just let me know. Yeah, if you need a copy of the slides or anything else, and I can give you those.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Stein. Thank you so much for your expertise and your efforts and for your time. We really appreciate you, and thank you so much again for facilitating. And we really appreciate the research capacity development. Thank you so much, Prof.
Right. Thanks. Have a great day.
Okay, have a great one, Sam. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so then I'll quickly just deal with the difference between confidentiality and anonymity, and when how that affects the research process and obviously the ethics of that. So if you are going to be, let's say you're doing interviews or focus group discussions, all right? That information that you get from those kinds of discussions are going to be confidential. And the reason for that is that you as the researcher then know who the people are that you have interviewed or that you are having the focus group discussion with. So if they come to you and say, I want to withdraw my interview, or I want to withdraw my focus group discussion input, they are able to do that without any harm or without any adverse effects to them. It might adversely affect your research, but you have to then just make sure at what point are they going to say, no, I want to withdraw my comments? Is it going to be when you maybe do some member checking or something like that? So that's very, very important. And the reason why I bring that up is because very often we don't understand what the difference is between confidentiality and anonymity. So when information is confidential, it means that you then know who that person is. You might be able to contact them. And if they do contact you to say, I want to withdraw my comments or I want to withdraw my participation, you know how to identify the data that you have received and take it out of your data set, and then you'll have to analyze or do whatever it is that you need to do. When it comes to a anonymous survey or an anonymous questionnaire, for example, and somebody has given their consent, and then they might contact you and say, oh, but I want to withdraw my comments, or I want to withdraw from the questionnaire or participating in the survey or whatever the case is. Then it becomes a little bit more tricky, because now you don't know who that person is and where their data is sitting, because you have anonymized your questionnaire. So unless you've set it up, which then is not anonymous, let's say, for example, using a Google Doc, and you want them to leave their email address, then it's not really anonymous anymore. It then becomes confidential. So I know that, especially in our faculty, some of our students get a little bit confused between when is data anonymous and when is it actually confidential. So what you need to just have a look at, in our faculty, Prof. Stein has developed a wonderful set of forms. So all the consent forms have paragraphs very explicitly explaining, are there going to be any benefits? Is the information confidential or anonymous? And as the researcher, you then complete that form, and it gives a lot of information back to the participant. But also when you are referring to it in text, so when you're getting your proposal sorted, you need to make sure that there's no discrepancy between what you think is confidential data, but is actually anonymous, or vice versa. So, you know, and I think that would run across all faculties as well, is just to make sure that you really understand the difference between anonymous data and confidential data. And then the other thing that I just want to bring up is, as a student or as a researcher, you also have an ethical responsibility in the way that you write up your data. So if your data has been de-identified, or if it is completely anonymous, etc., then, you know, the way that you present your data shouldn't be too much of a problem, because there's no way that anybody can be identified as giving you that data. However, when it comes to your qualitative research, and you've got focus group discussions or interviews and things like that, you've got to be really careful in terms of the coding that you use and how you give a person that is responding, or you're going to give them their voice, how you de-identify that particular person and how you describe the context within which they come from. So I'm from sports, so I'll give you an example, a sport example. So let's say, for example, I want to go and look at the number of female coaches coaching football in SAFA, right? And what I find out is that, let's say, for example, the head coach has criticized the way that women coaches are being dealt with in terms of opportunities, etc., that are available in SAFA. This is just an example, right? And I don't de-identify that coach sufficiently. It could then come back to her, okay, because everybody knows who the head coaches are. It could then come back, and she could then be in a little bit of trouble, because maybe now she brought the SAFA into disrepute, or her line manager or somebody else didn't know that this is how she was feeling, or, you know, things like that. So you've got to make sure that your ethical principles follow all the way through the research process. It's not just in the way that you do your proposal and then conduct your research and gather your data. It's also very important that those are followed through right to the very end, where you are submitting for examination, and even if you are writing up any journal articles. So I think when we look at ethics, it's not just something that we all focus on during the proposal stage, because we all need to get ethical clearance before we can go and collect data. But it goes through right from when you start with your proposal all the way through to when you submit your thesis or your dissertation, and then obviously all the way through to writing up a journal article. So I just wanted to bring those up with you as well. And I don't know if there's any further questions that you would like to go through. Please share example of how the ethical clearance certificate looks. Okay, I apologize. If I was on my computer, I'd be able to show you what the Faculty of Health Sciences looks like. But basically what you'll do is you'll get a letter from the research ethics chair within your faculty, and they will then, in that letter, it will say that you have been given ethical clearance. This is the ethical clearance number that you have got, and then it will usually be signed by the chair of the Faculty Research Ethics Committee. Gabriel, I see that you've got your hand up.
Yes, you may speak.
Yes, of course.
Thank you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear him, Prof?
Yes, we can.
Okay, Prof, you can proceed.
Thanks, Prof, for a wonderful and very insightful presentation. I just have two questions that I wanted to ask. One, it's on self-plagiarism. I just wanted to know if there are any sort of ethical aspects, that governs the issue of self-plagiarism. Then the other one is on data protection. If the ethical guidelines in terms of the data storage, the data that you'd have collected, how is it stored, and also like how many years should the data be kept before it is you can destroy it, or before it is destroyed? Thank you.
Okay, I'll try and answer those questions. Yeah, so the thing on self-plagiarism is quite an interesting one, especially, for example, let's say you're doing your doctorate and it's an extension or an expansion rather of your PhD study. You've got to be very careful how you navigate self-plagiarism. So, for example, if you've got a whole lot of journal articles that you have written and using those in your research, then obviously you need to make sure that those are referenced correctly. But you also can't just take chunks out of your, let's say, your master's and just put it back into your PhD. So the self-plagiarism becomes difficult when you have done a lot of research in the area, and you might now become the expert in the area, and now you have to make sure that you do acknowledge, even if it is yourself, that you acknowledge the research that you have done. So you do have to at least ensure that you are acknowledging any of the research that you may have either led or have done with any co-authors, or even if it was from a master's, that you actually put that in there. So it works the same way as any other plagiarism. Then with regards to the data protection, there are SOPs, both from I know that within the Faculty of Health Sciences, we have our own SOP with regards to that, but there are also institutional ones. And I think what we can do is we could possibly share some of those SOPs so that we can send them out to everybody here. And it's, I know the SOPs are quite laborious to read, but they're very, very essential, because then at least you have a very good understanding when it comes to your write-up. Again, I'm talking about in your proposal stage. You can make reference back to those SOPs, which will give you very specific guidelines as to where does the data need to be stored, how long does it need to be stored for, who will have access to that particular data, etc., etc. So the SOPs will determine exactly how all of that, how the data management needs to be handled, and we can send those through to you.
All right. No, thank you, Prof, for the answer.
No problem. Thank you.
All right.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof, for clarifying on that question. There is another question in the chat box. It says, who gives consent for radiographs in government hospitals or university-linked hospitals?
I think Prof. Stein went through that when in his presentation. So as far as I know, again, you'd have to have your ethical clearance, and then I think in government hospitals there is almost like a provincial research committee. So that proposal with your ethical clearance would need to go through that process, and then they would give consent to allow you access. And the same thing would be for a university-linked hospital. You'd still need to remember the difference between consent and permission that Prof. Stein went through. So you would need to just find out what the processes are and the differences between a government and a university-linked hospital. If it's a university-linked hospital, even although you've got ethical clearance and the hospital is linked to the university, you would still need to get consent or permission from whichever department you're going to be working with inside that particular hospital. So again, it goes back to the gatekeeping and who is able to gain access, because once you've got your ethical clearance, you then want permission to gain access to a specific population, whether it's in a hospital or at a school or in a club, or whatever your context is.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof, for clarifying further on that question. I hope you answered there, Oluwafemi. I don't know if there's any other questions from the participants. You may type them in the chat box, or you may raise your virtual hand before we may close the session. So if you have any further questions for Prof. Just a reminder as well as just a reminder to say that I have posted the feedback survey in the chat box, and I kindly request all the participants to kindly fill it out. And also this will ensure that you get a certificate of attendance for this workshop. So I just kindly ask everybody to fill it out and gain insights on how this workshop is useful and how we can also improve in the future, as well as to provide some kind words for our facilitators today. Thank you so much.
All right, I don't think there are any other questions.
Okay, in that sense, if there isn't any questions, I don't know if you would allow me there, Prof, to close the session or end the session. I think everybody there is answered. I see no hands raised, no questions in the chat box. If that's fine with you, we may once again end the session.
Thank you very much. And thanks very much for the RCD for hosting this. And I hope that everybody got something worthwhile out of this session. Thank you very much. We'll chat
Thank you.
again soon.
Thank you so much, Prof, for being available, for honoring our invite, and thank you again for your time and expertise and efforts. We really appreciate you, and thank you so much to all the participants for joining today and making this workshop a very fruitful one for everybody. And I hope everybody came out with something from this workshop. We really, really do appreciate you, Prof. And thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day further. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.
Okay, thank you. Bye.